Why do people get fired up about things like this? Let's use some anthropology to try and understand it. Hi, and welcome to Anthropology in 10 or Less. I'm your host, Michael Kilman, and today's topic is cultural appropriation. If we're going to talk about cultural appropriation, we have to define three different things. The first is white privilege, then cultural borrowing, and then, of course, cultural appropriation. Now, first up, white privilege. Now, I know some of you are already rolling your eyes, but just give me a chance. If we really want to understand this cultural appropriation thing, then we have to understand what white privilege is. So obviously I'm a white guy. So white guys and gals out there, before I studied anthropology, I too rolled my eyes at that white privilege idea and said, forget that, I worked hard for where I'm at. But white privilege is not about who works hard. It's just about stereotypes. Basically, light-skinned is assumed by many people to be a neutral state, one without preconceptions. But dark skin? Nope. If you have darker skin, then there are a number of assumptions about your work ethic, your attitude, your level of education, intelligence, and so on. But now you may say to yourself, wait a second, I have plenty of friends who aren't white and I treat them the same. And with your friends, it's probably true. But remember, your conscious mind is only the tip of the iceberg. Most of what goes on in your perceptions of people and your daily interactions come from your subconscious. Here's a few examples of subconscious bias. A 2012 study showed that all white juries were 16% more likely to convict a black defendant. Black men make up only 6% of the population, but constituted 40% of all police-related deaths in 2015. And of course, there's a famous resume study where those with white-sounding names got 50% more callbacks than those with black-sounding names. There are really endless studies out there demonstrating that most of us are biased on a subconscious level. And by the way, even if some of these seem minor, it adds up over the course of an entire lifetime. It's like if you sat on a cactus once. It would be inconvenient and kind of a pain in the ass. But imagine if every freaking chair you ever sat on in your life had a cactus in it. You'd probably never sit down. Why, here, Joe, have a seat. So what is white privilege then? It's the assumption by the general populace on at least a subconscious level that because of your relationship to your European ancestry, you're a good and reliable person. Think about it like this. If every day of your life you see a black man portrayed as a criminal in the news, then your brain will make the subconscious assumption that black equals criminal. Our subconscious mind is kind of a dick. Okay, so let's move on to cultural borrowing. It's pretty simple. When two different cultures get together, they trade ideas. We see this all over the place. That's why you get this, and this, and of course this. Cultural borrowing is really just the exchange of ideas. That's all there is to it. And human beings really like to trade stuff. I mean, you gotta catch them all, right? So that brings us to number 3, cultural appropriation. And the key here is the term appropriation. It's not just an exchange of ideas. It's like a hostile takeover of another culture. It's like some dude going into a bank with a gun and saying, "Give me all your culture." But let's break it down into 3 criteria to understand the difference between cultural borrowing and cultural appropriation. 1. Is the act of borrowing disrespectful or demeaning to something sacred or important in the culture? Something like a Native American headdress is really sacred and important status symbol in their culture. In fact, the headdresses are not made all at once, but often a feather was awarded for doing something important within the culture. It's kind of like when we give soldiers medals for risking their lives in battle. So putting it on a nearly naked woman for the purpose of fashion is super disrespectful. 2. Does the borrowing of this cultural idea further support established stereotypes? Stereotypes don't just happen overnight. They happen over a long period of time, and cultural appropriation can continue to foster the long-term stereotypes, which can be measurably damaging for some people's lives as we illustrated above. 3. Does this borrowing involve a power dynamic? In other words, is one group oppressed by another either presently or historically? So is this a tool to further oppression or disenfranchise the people? One way that you can disenfranchise people is by commodifying their culture. If you turn someone else's cultural practice or object into a profit machine for your own benefit, definitely appropriation. Especially if the group you took something from doesn't see any of the profit or benefits from it. All right, this might all still seem really confusing, so I want to take a look at 2 different cases. Both of them involve football. First, okay, get the croning out now, yep. We're gonna talk about the Redskins. So the origin of the term Redskin appears to just describe Native Americans, and that doesn't sound so bad, right? Well, the real problem is this. The state reward for dead Indians has been increased to $200 for every Redskin sent to purgatory. The sum is more than the dead bodies of all the Indians east of the Red River are worth. See, the early colonial and American governments paid bounty hunters to go out and kill and scalp Native Americans. Yes, it was the Europeans who started the whole scalping thing. When they came back, they would be asked, "All right, how many Redskins you got for me?" In other words, the term Redskin referred to the amount of scalps you would turn in for bounty for reward. Kind of awful, right? All right, let's take a look at the criteria then. 1. Is it disrespectful or demeaning? So it is true that a 2015 survey done by the Washington Post showed that 90% of Native Americans didn't feel like the team name or logo was a big deal. Now keep in mind, only 504 Native Americans were surveyed out of 5 million. And in 2015, several Native American rights organizations that represent approximately 1.2 million Native Americans won a lawsuit against the Washington team to remove the rights of their trademark. So even if the people surveyed didn't care, there are a number of organizations and people out there who do. 2. Does it contribute to stereotypes? The short answer is yes. A 2008 study showed that part of the problem here is that there are very few positive representations of Native Americans out there in the world, and in general that, quote, American Indian mascots thus remind American Indians of the limited ways in which others see them. They also found that in 2 of the case studies they examined showed that despite situations where American Indians were represented positively, the images were, quote, not only associated with depressed self-esteem, it was also associated with decreased feelings of community worth. Additionally, a recent study that was published just a few weeks ago in January of 2017 looked at how branding of logos of Native Americans impacted both conscious and subconscious bias. The results on conscious bias were minimal. But in the case of subconscious bias, the researchers showed, quote, that the exposure to such imagery can also activate stereotypes in the broader population. In other words, many of these portrayals can contribute to the subconscious bias we talked about earlier that disenfranchised Native Americans. 3. Does it involve a power dynamic? Absolutely. I mean, the oppression of Native Americans has been absolutely unbelievable. If you have any doubt of this, just know that Hitler got his idea of the concentration camps from the American reservation system. Plus, the NFL team makes millions every year off this image, so they're using another culture to make a lot of money without any benefit to the culture. Second example, let's take a look at the Florida Seminoles. Number 1, is it disrespectful or demeaning? Well, in this particular case, the tribe that the team is representing doesn't generally think so. In fact, there's been an ongoing collaboration between the Seminole tribe and the Florida team since 1947. Some of the ways that the tribe uses the mascot is to recount the historical narratives about some of the tribe's more successful acts of resistance against the American government. So they kind of use it for an educational tool. To be fair, there are some individuals within the tribe that aren't so happy about this relationship. But in 2006, when the NCAA banned Native American mascots, the tribe itself passed a resolution within their own government to support the school's mascot that ultimately granted Florida State an exemption from the rule. 2. Does it contribute to stereotypes? Well, unfortunately it could, but there's a large difference here between the Redskins, who basically use Hollywood stereotypes to represent Native Americans, and the Seminole team, who actively consult on the tribe on what forms of dress and attire are to be used. And that does make a difference, because there are 562 federally recognized tribes in this country, and only a handful of them are the Plains Indians that we see in Hollywood. Number 3, what about the power dynamic? Sure. There's definitely a power dynamic here, but despite the past power dynamic, the present collaboration between the university and the tribal government allows for both parties to be on more even grounds. And even though the tribe doesn't receive money from the college does provide scholarships and other opportunities for tribal members. So I've been talking a lot about collaboration here. Why? Because everyone, every culture, every person has the right to represent themselves how they want to be represented. So if the Seminole tribe wants to take part in this representation, then that's cultural borrowing. The Redskins, on the other hand, they're essentially stealing elements of a culture and misrepresenting an entire group of people. The Redskins are contributing to the long-standing tradition of taking the rights of self-determination away from the Native American people. Native Americans have had to fight tooth and nail to survive colonization for the past 500 years, be it the brutal violence and enslavement brought on by the conquistadors, the Trail of Tears ordered by President Andrew Jackson, the horror of an entire generations of children taken by force from their families and forced into boarding schools, to the events like Wounded Knee and the Sand Creek massacres, or even the recent events up at Standing Rock. Native Americans have spent generations fighting to have their right to self-determination, and taking away their right to represent themselves in the name of a national sports team can be often just another reminder of the long history of struggle that Native Americans still endure. I really do hope that this was helpful in understanding the difference between cultural borrowing and appropriation. But that's all for now in Anthropology in 10 or Less. Join us next time when we explore language and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.